Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. For tonight's story, we're going to travel far back into the past, to the frontiers of legend and history, to explore one of the most famous mythical tales ever told, the story of the Trojan War. Or was it mythical? We'll find out what archaeology can tell us about this too. But let's start immediately with our first story of the night. Once upon a time, so long ago that men almost lost memory of these events, the king of gods, Zeus, became annoyed at the sheer number of humans and half-gods populating the earth. Since he had overthrown his father, Cronus, and began to rule the earth along with other Olympian gods, humans had multiplied. Among them, too, many heroes and demigods born from the relationships between gods and humans. Zeus himself was not the last to get involved with humans. He was unfaithful to his wife, Hera, and from his relationships with many gods, many children were born. Even more worrisome to him, Zeus learned from a prophecy foretelling that he would be overthrown by one of his own sons, like he had overthrown Cronus, and like Cronus had overthrown his own father, Uranus, at the dawn of time. The threat was serious, and yet another prophecy stated that the son he bore with Thetis, a young and beautiful sea nymph with whom Zeus had fallen in love, would become even greater than Zeus himself. In order to do away with all these problems, Zeus came up with a plan. First, he ordered Thetis to marry the elderly king Puedes. He then made sure that all the gods were invited to the wedding. When all the gods arrived bearing gifts, Zeus ordered Hermes, the messenger of the gods, to stop Eris, the goddess of discord, at the door. Eris was a minor deity, but one who had the power of creating strife, of sowing the seeds of discord between gods or between men. Eris threw a gift of her own from the door, just as Zeus expected. The gift was a golden apple upon which was inscribed the words, "To the fairest." This apple became the most desired prize at the assembly, and 3 goddesses at the gathering, Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite, immediately tried to claim this gift as their own and argued fiercely over the apple, just as Zeus had anticipated. The 3 goddesses could not come to an agreement, and none of the other gods present dared to offer an opinion in favor of one of them, for fear of antagonizing the other 2. Zeus just smiled under his beard, seeing that the first part of his plan was working as expected. Zeus had manipulated the 3 goddesses into engaging in a bitter feud. Eventually, Zeus ordered Hermes to lead the 3 goddesses to Paris, the prince of Troy, and ruled that Paris would decide to whom the golden apple should belong. Troy was the most powerful and wealthiest of all cities, and it was protected by walls so high and so strong that no army could ever dream of defeating it. Paris was a prince of Troy, but didn't know it. He was raised as a shepherd and kept far away from the city because of a prophecy stating that Paris would be the downfall of Troy. As an anonymous shepherd, there was no threat he could fulfill the prophecy and threaten the city. Hermes led the goddess to Paris, and the three goddesses bathed nude in a spring and appeared to him naked in their perfection in order to win Paris's approval and gain the apple. Paris was unable to decide between them, and the goddesses eventually resorted to bribes. Athena, as the goddess of military glory and knowledge, offered Paris bravery, wisdom, and the ability of the greatest warriors. She thought there was no way Paris could refuse her offer. He was all about power and influence. She offered Paris control of Asia and more power than any human king had ever possessed. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, also had weapons, and she knew the herd of young men. She offered Paris the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Helen was married Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and her legendary beauty was famous all across the known world. Paris couldn't resist such a tempting offer and awarded the apple to Aphrodite, much to the ire of Athena and Hera. Paris couldn't have known so, but his choice accomplished Zeus's plan to bring war to the world. And as the prophecy had said, he would be the downfall of Troy, and many warriors and heroes would die because of the folly of men and gods alike. But before we continue with our story, allow me to welcome you to tonight's episode. I hope you've already made yourself comfortable, and if not, give yourself a moment to get settled and to let all that tension in your body drain. Let today's concerns fade into the background as you listen to the sound of my voice. Tonight we're going to discover the Iliad, the story of the war by Greek author Homer, and we will also explore the reality of Troy. I hope you'll enjoy our exploration tonight. Is the Trojan War fact or fiction? Because even though Homer's story is a part of Greek mythology, these myths are not baseless. Troy really did exist. Its ruins were discovered in the 19th century, after scholars believed for centuries that it was purely mythical. The ruins held a wealth of artifacts and information about Greek antiquity that led to further discoveries and hypotheses about early Greek civilization. We will discuss all of this tonight. And because the story of Troy is one of the greatest stories ever told, there will also be a lot of storytelling. I will soon publish more Greek mythology stories, like the labors of Heracles and the Odyssey. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and only focus on the sound of my voice as we embark on this adventure together. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are listed below. Also below you will find links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and more. If you are so kind, please subscribe to my channel and click the like button. This helps it support the channel and keep it free from interrupting ad breaks. Please also follow us on Facebook for announcements. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position, take a long, deep, relaxing breath. When you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders and allow the sound of my voice guide you through this journey. And now let's return to mythical times. So Paris had granted Aphrodite the golden apple, and his prize would be the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Her beauty was of divine origins. Her father was Zeus himself, and her mother was Leda, a princess who had also become a Spartan queen. Zeus had a talent for seducing mortal women through trickery. To seduce Leda, he had presented himself to her as a swan, and, unafraid of the bird, enchanted by its elegance, the princess had let Zeus have his way with her. From this relationship was born Helen, raised by the king of Sparta as his daughter, despite her parentage by Zeus. Helen was a charming child, but as the years went by and she became a woman, and her beauty grew in fame all around Greece, she soon had scores of suitors willing to do anything for her hand in marriage. He was unwilling to choose one for fear the others would retaliate violently. Among the suitors was Odysseus from the island of Ithaca, one of the various kingdoms of Greece. Odysseus may not have been the strongest or the bravest of all suitors, but he was the most astute. And besides Helen, he had also set his eyes on another Spartan woman, Penelope. So Odysseus came up with a plan. In exchange for the king's support of his pursuit of Penelope, Odysseus would solve the dilemma of Helen's marriage, get Helen married without the retaliation of all other suitors if they wanted to be chosen. Potential suitors would have to swear an oath to defend a marriage of Helen regardless of whom the king would choose. In this way, none of them would be able to deny the marriage and retaliate once Helen's husband was announced. All the suitors swore to the oath to stay in the race for Helen's hand, and the king could now make his choice. As promised, the king supported Odysseus in his pursuit of Penelope and could take her back to Ithaca. The king of Sparta chose Menelaus to marry his daughter, a man of great wealth and power. Menelaus had promised Aphrodite that he would sacrifice 100 oxen if he won Helen's hand, and had sent his brother Agamemnon to petition the king on his behalf. His wealth and power made him a good political choice for the king. However, Menelaus forgot about the promise he had made to Aphrodite, and the goddess became irritated when he failed to sacrifice 100 oxen. Helen had two brothers and one sister, Castor, Pollux, and Clytemnestra. One of the brothers should have rightfully become the king of Sparta, but both became gods instead. So the throne instead went to Helen's husband, Menelaus. This is how Menelaus became the new king of Sparta after her father's death. Clytemnestra, Helen's sister, married Agamemnon, Menelaus' brother, and he became the king of Mycenae, another Greek kingdom. It seems all was well. The two brothers marrying the two sisters worked out well and resolved the issues of succession. Menelaus was delighted with his new beautiful wife, but they ignored Zeus's plan. The feud between the three goddesses and the judgment of Paris, which led to Helen being promised to Paris by Aphrodite. By promising Helen to Paris, Aphrodite not only had won the contest for the golden apple, she was able to take revenge on Menelaus for forgetting to fulfill his promise to sacrifice 100 oxen in her honor. All of these events unfolded in Sparta. Paris returned to Troy, no longer a humble sheep herder, but as an acknowledged prince. It was now time for him to claim his prize, the love of Helen of Sparta. Troy was not part of the Greek world. The Greeks, or Archaeans, these are synonyms, lived in and around the Peloponnese Peninsula, on islands on either side of it, in the Ionian and Aegean seas. Troy was a foreign city and kingdom in the east coast of Anatolia. Under the guise of a diplomatic mission, Paris traveled to Sparta while King Menelaus was away. He had gone to Crete. Aphrodite was on standby, ready to deliver Helen to Paris. Just before Paris entered the palace in Sparta, she instructed her son, Eros, the little winged god of desire, to shoot an arrow at Helen. The arrows of Eros made people fall immediately in love with the next person they saw and made them physically attracted in a way that could not be suppressed. As soon as Helen saw Paris, she fell in love with him. Taking advantage of the king's absence, the two lovers sailed to Troy. Zeus and the other gods watched these events unfold from their perch on Mount Olympus. And the king of gods was satisfied how the seeds of discord he had manipulated Eros into sowing were now beginning to flourish. One of the most powerful Achaean kings, the king of Sparta, Menelaus, had been humiliated by a foreigner taking his wife in his absence, and with her consent no less. Add to that fact that all of Helen's suitors had been sworn by Odysseus to defend her marriage to Menelaus, following Odysseus' trick to make it accepted. And the former suitors were bound all to participate in an inevitable war between the Achaeans and the Trojans to return Helen to Menelaus and restore his honor. In a desperate attempt to avoid a war, Menelaus traveled to Troy with his closest ally, Odysseus. The two attempted to recover Helen via diplomatic means but failed, and war was soon to begin. There are still many events and characters yet to intervene, but let's pause for a moment and take a look at the historical basis of all of this. The primary source of the story of the Trojan War is the Iliad, as I mentioned before, the ancient Greek poem by Homer, together with the Odyssey, also attributed to Homer. These two poems are the central works of ancient Greek literature. There is no doubt that these texts are ancient. They are dated to around 8th century BC, when their oldest known written form appeared. But we don't know for certain whether Homer existed or whether he is a legendary figure. Some scholars believed he was a genius poet and author, the first ever in the Western history to attach his name to literary works. Other scholars favor the theory that the Odyssey and the Iliad are the result of storytelling, reworking by various contributors and collaborators. In that case, Homer would just be a legendary figure created to embody this tradition of poems written in epic or Homeric Greek, which was a literary language in the 18th century BC. The ancient Greek language was far from unified, like in Chinese or Arabic. There was a literary form of the language used for writing that was different from the way people spoke in everyday life. In Western countries, in modern times, this distinction between written and spoken language has diminished considerably. We still don't write exactly as we speak. In most cases, when we do, the writing sounds very informal. But there is no longer a major distinction between spoken vernacular and written form that existed centuries ago. In other language, there is still a big distinction between the two forms. Two registers, like, for example, in Arabic before. There are many Arabic-speaking countries, but people actually learn distinct varieties or registers of the language when they grow up. One is the Arabic dialect spoken in the country in everyday life, and nowadays someone from Morocco or Algeria would have a hard time communicating with another Arabic speaker from the Persian Gulf and their respective dialects. There is also a more formal register called Modern Standard Arabic, which directly comes from the Classical Arabic, and this one is identical all across the Arabic-speaking world. It is used as the official language and in written communications. It is also the registered, and it is taught in schools and used for every formal situation. The mastering of Standard Arabic is an indicator of how educated people are, but the vast majority of Arabic speakers can navigate to some extent between the everyday, informal dialect and the literary form of Arabic. It has now been strongly attenuated, but English had the same kind of distinction between an elevated literary language and a colloquial form that was spoken every day. In the 11th century, about 1,000 years ago, there was an old form of English that served as the official and literary language, but it was displaced by Latin and the Old French after the Norman conquest of England. This didn't make the spoken English disappear, and England had completely different languages coexisting at the same time, depending on whether it was spoken or written, and on the level of formality Standardized literary English emerged over the following centuries, replacing Latin, and it became dominant by the end of the Middle Ages. But as it developed in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, it absorbed a lot of terms from classical languages, from Latin, from Greek, from French. And though this process, many words, many terms with Latin roots, made their way into common English and have remained a part of it, this is why English speakers can recognize many words in French, Italian, or Spanish text. These Latin-based terms arrived by literary English, and then over the past 2 or 3 centuries, all Western countries have gone through a process of merging of the two registers. Something of this remains. We don't exactly write as we speak, but for several centuries already, Western languages have lost these distinctions between the everyday and the literary registers. So this was a long digression. So let's return to Homer. I was telling you that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in the literary form of ancient Greece, and that Homer may or may not be a single author. Ancient Greeks believed that the Iliad exaggerated events for the sake of poetry and storytelling, but there is no question that the story itself had its roots in history. They didn't question the veracity of the Trojan War and believed it had happened several centuries before the time of classical Greece, around 1200 BC. But did they also believe the myth of the gods intervening in human affairs and that heroes walked the earth? It's hard to know for sure, but classical writings seem to indicate that the population actually believed these events to also be true. Even though some were unsure of all of the details, and which of them had been exaggerated by storytellers, the educated elite was more split. Some believed there was at least partial truth in the tales, whereas others rejected mythology as superstition or an equivalent to fairy tales. Still, all across Greece, mythology was respected as something unifying, and it was culture. There was no strict delineation between mythology, theater, and literature. A lot of activities and traditions in ancient Greece were deeply rooted in religion and mythology. From the legitimacy of city-states to the economic activities of temples to a theater or the Olympic Games. It wasn't in anyone's interest to attack these myths, and so they were passed from generation to generation, with new artists adding new anecdotes so that the myths never stopped evolving. But the core of Greek mythology that was present in classic Greece probably began to emerge 1,000 years before, around the 18th century BC. It was passed on orally for centuries until it began to be put in writing, as far as we know, around the 8th century BC, the time of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The importance of this body of stories cannot be underestimated, and maybe you've noticed that they often sound familiar, even when we don't know of them. This is because these myths are the basis for a large part of Western storytelling traditions. These stories have been rewritten and retold countless times. They keep being told nowadays with different characters and different settings. For example, think back to the story I told you in the beginning You may recognize the storyline of Sleeping Beauty, when the goddess Iris is banned from a wedding and taking her revenge with a curse. This is exactly the bad fairy, Maleficent, cursing the princess because she was not invited, as in the storyline of Sleeping Beauty. From Zeus's multiple affairs, the attempts of revenge by Hera against Heracles, the river race between gods and goddesses, the initiation journeys of heroes to misunderstandings leading to dramatic consequences, the cautionary tales, these devices still form the foundation of the books, movies, and TV shows we read it in novels and comic books. Of course, a lot of these elements are universal and found in many countries around the world. But when it comes to Western storytelling tradition, and the Middle Eastern as well, they were put in writing around the time of ancient Greece, primarily in mythology and in stories such as the Trojan War. So let's return to our story. Troy had refused to return Helen to Menelaus, and war was now unavoidable. All the Greeks, all the Achaean kingdom were oath-bound to defend the marriage of Helen and the king of Sparta. Menelaus asked his brother Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, to uphold his oath. Agamemnon agreed and sent emissaries to all the Achaean kingdoms, asking them to also honor their oath. No Greek warrior or hero could ignore the call. Among them was Ajax, a great-grandson of Zeus and a famous warrior. He was a colossus, known to be fearless in combat. Another hero the Greeks counted was Achilles, and Achilles was no stranger to the story because he was the son of Thetis, the nymph who had been married to an elderly king, which we mentioned at the beginning of our story. The same wedding which had Eros sow discord among the goddesses with the golden apple. Achilles had been the subject of prophecies even before the war began, one of which said that he would die of old age after an uneventful life, but full and happy, or that he would die young on the battlefield, after which he would gain immortality through poetry. Even when he was a child, another prophecy declared that Troy could never fall without Achilles' support. This last prophecy was told by Calchas, an augur from the city of Argos. Calchas was a seer. He could receive knowledge from the past, the present, and the future from the god Apollo, and he also joined the Achaean army. Thetis was naturally very fond of her son, Achilles, and attempted to make him immortal, bathing him in the river Styx, which ran to the underworld. And while she bathes him in it while he was still an infant, this made Achilles seemingly invulnerable wherever he was touched by the water of the Styx. But as she bathed him, she held him by his heel, meaning that this small part of his body had remained mortal and vulnerable to injury. As Achilles grew into adulthood, he became the greatest of all mortals. Strong, fast, agile, but also brave and perfectly confident in his abilities. He had been sent, along with Ajax, to the centaur Chiron to be raised and trained, and no other warrior in Greece would have been foolish enough to challenge him. Still, his mother knew the prophecies, especially the one that declared he would die young in battle, and news of the upcoming war spread across Greece. She was terrified for his life. She chose to hide him on the island of Skyros in the Aegean Sea, in the court of King Lycomedes when the emissaries arrived. Odysseus and Ajax. She disguised him as a woman and hoping they would not find him. But they did. They blew a horn, which happened when invaders were arriving, and instead of fleeing, Achilles took up a spear and prepared for combat. He was found out, and to the despair of his mother, he decided to join the Achaean army. The Greek forces gathered. Calchas the ogre was among them. A sacrifice was made to Apollo to attract his favors, and so that the future held. After the sacrifice was made, a snake slithered away from Apollo's altar to a nearby tree and, finding a sparrow's nest, ate the mother sparrow and her 9 chicks before turning to stone. Seeing this, Calchas interpreted it as a sign that Troy would fall, but only in the 10th year of war. The route to Troy was by sea, beyond the Aegean Sea, and to carry Greek forces, an immense fleet of more than 1,000 ships had been gathered. But as the fleet set sail to Anatolia, a storm scattered their ships, ending the invasion before it could even begin. It took 8 long years, but the fleet was eventually gathered again. But the determination of Menelaus, Agamemnon, and their allies like Odysseus paid off. 8 years later, the fleet was once again ready, and now comprised 1,200 galleys, each with dozens of warriors from all over Greece, the mainland, the Peloponnese, the Aegean Islands, Crete, Ithaca, 1,000 men ready to attack the most formidable city in the known world. But again, as the fleet prepared to depart, the winds suddenly ceased in a way that was unnatural, even suspicious. Could it be that some of the gods were working against the Greeks? Calchas the prophet was called upon to explain what was happening, and he revealed that Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and wild animals, daughter of Zeus and sister of Apollo, was doing this to punish Agamemnon for having slain a sacred deer, and then boasted that he was a better hunter than even Artemis herself. Artemis decided to make Agamemnon pay for his arrogance. Calchas also revealed that the only way to appease the goddess was to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon initially refused, but then finally relented, realizing this was the only means by which he could lead the expedition and honor his oath to his brother. So he finally performed the sacrifice. The more vengeful goddess like Hera would have certainly let the sacrifice happen, but Artemis had a good heart, so at the last moment she took pity on the girl. She took her to be a maiden in one of her temples, and she replaced her with a lamb. Iphigenia was saved. The winds returned, and finally the Achaeans could set sail for Troy. The Iliad is famous for its telling of the Trojan War, but not how I'm telling you the story at the moment, since the poem actually only covers a few weeks of the war, towards its end, while also alludes to several events that happened before. The Odyssey also brings more elements of the story, and the rest is a long tradition shaped by many authors over the centuries. There are often different versions of the same episode. I have chosen one for tonight, but variations exist. We are now going to see events that happened during the first 9 years of the war, before the Iliad begins. So the Greeks had gathered forces from their many kingdoms, but Troy also had allies. From Anatolia, from Thrace, many peoples had answered the call for help. This Trojan alliance was no less formidable than the Greeks. This was more than just a fight between the Greeks and Troy. It was a battle between the Greek world and barbarians, and the eastern peoples gathered under the Trojan banner. Two worlds were about to start fighting. From Mount Olympus, Zeus watched with satisfaction, his plan unraveling. The earth would be cleaned of its too many warriors and demigods, spawned by himself and other gods, and this was a divine conflict, too. On the Greek side, Hera and Athena, the two angry goddesses who had lost the golden apple to Aphrodite. On the Trojan side, Aphrodite, Poseidon, the god of seas, and Apollo, who, as we'll see later, used their power to hinder the Greeks. The Trojans also had their heroes, the most notable of whom was Hector, son of Priam and brother of Paris. Priam was the older king of Troy, and had fathered many children, including Princess Hector, Paris, Deiphobus, and Helenus. Hector was a talented warrior and commanded a Trojan army on par with Greek heroes like Ajax or Achilles. Calchas the ogre made a prophecy about the arrival of the Achaeans. The first to walk on Trojan land would also be the first to die. Obviously, no one dared to step off their ships, knowing this. Odysseus once again solved and saved the situation with one of his tricks. He threw his shield on the beach and landed on it. Another Greek, Protesilaus, seeing this, and assuming Odysseus had been the first to set foot on Trojan soil, so he did too. But Odysseus had not really walked on Trojan land, since he was standing on his shield, and Protesilaus soon fell victim to the prophecy, dying after engaging in a single combat with Hector, and he was killed by the Trojan leader. However, things went rather well for the Greeks on the first day of combat. They slayed many Trojans and were able to occupy the beach, whereas the Trojans fled to safety of their city walls. The walls were the most formidable in the world, so high and so strong that legend attributed they were built by gods Poseidon and Apollo himself. Following the retreat of the Trojans behind their city's walls, the Greeks besieged Troy for the 9 following years. The walls were so high and thick that an assault was unthinkable. The city itself was so large that it couldn't be entirely encircled, meaning that Troy could still receive supplies. Still, the Greeks sent their armies, led by heroes such as Ajax or Achilles, to raid the surrounding land of Trojan allies. Achilles raided several cities and among the loot brought back an enslaved woman of remarkable beauty, Briseis. Agamemnon also captured another seducing slave, Chryseis, but still the Trojans would not exit the safety of their city walls. The Trojans knew that time was on their side, and that the Achaeans could not remain in Troy and away from their homes and kingdoms forever. The strategy began to pay off. By the end of the 9th year, thousands of warriors refused to obey their leaders and demanded to return home. It took the aura of Achilles to convince them to stay for now. But the worst was still ahead for the Achaeans, and this is where the tale of the Iliad begins, in the 10th year of the siege. The father of Chryseis, the enslaved woman captured by Agamemnon, was a priest of Apollo and came to Agamemnon to ask for the return of his daughter. Agamemnon refused and even insulted the priest, which enraged Apollo. The god Apollo then afflicted the Achaean army with a plague, forcing the leader to return Chryseis to her father. As compensation for the loss of the slave, Agamemnon took Achilles' captured enslaved woman, Briseis, for himself. Achilles, insulted and enraged by Agamemnon's actions, Achilles decided he would no longer fight and withdrew from the war for now. The Trojans, seeing their enemy's morale shaken, decided it was time to bring the siege to an end. For the first time since the Greeks' initial landing, the two armies faced each other. A duel was agreed upon between two champions, Menelaus of Sparta and Paris of Troy, the two men who initially fought for Helen. But Paris was no match for Menelaus and was beaten. To save his life, the goddess Aphrodite snatched him from the field, refusing to let the man who chosen her to die. The two armies once again began to fight below the city walls. Warriors and heroes on both sides gave everything they had to destroy their enemies, inspired by the gods who supported them. Inspired by Athena, Greek god Diomedes, even goddess Aphrodite herself, thousands fell that day. But still, the battle ended without a decisive winner. In the days that followed, the Trojans exploited their psychological advantage and the absence of Achilles to drive the Greeks back to their camp. Achilles observed what was happening from afar. According to Greek tradition, warriors were paired with a companion. They were best friends and sometimes even lovers. Achilles' companion, who was also his relative, was Patroclus. And when Achilles withdrew from the war, so did Patroclus. But Patroclus wanted to fight, and seeing the progress made by the Trojans, Achilles allowed him to do so. Patroclus wearing his armor and leading Achilles' army. The next day, Patroclus bathed in glory as he led the Greeks in driving back the Trojans to the walls of their city and salvaging a desperate situation. The Greeks, thinking this man to be Achilles, were inspired, and as the Trojans re-entered their city in chaos, Patroclus, in Achilles' armor, thought to storm the city before the Trojans were able to close the doors behind them. But at this moment, fates and the will of God hit. Apollo stopped the Achaeans from entering Troy. Hector once again appeared to fight Patroclus, thinking he was Achilles, and not having the strength of his companion, and couldn't be the best Trojan hero. He was defeated and killed by Hector. After the death of their leader and this counterattack, the Greeks allowed the Trojans to return to their city. Once again, the situation was at a dead end. But Achilles was maddened by the death of Patroclus. He swore to kill Hector in revenge, which meant he had to re-enter the war, and so he reconciled with Agamemnon and received braces back from the Greek king. Having lost his armor and weapons to Patroclus in his battle with Hector, Achilles received new ones forged by Hephaestus, the god of metalworking and artisans himself. The next day, Achilles killed many on the battlefield, even nearly killing the Trojan hero Aeneas, who was saved at the last minute by Poseidon. The Trojan army once again fled to their walled city, but the goddess of Athena, protector of Achilles, was watching. She caused Hector to become disoriented and to stay outside. Now the two most formidable heroes of the war, Achilles and Hector, now faced each other. Achilles, burning with hate toward the killer of Patroclus, an epic fight followed, and each with their protector, Achilles with Athena, and Hector, Apollo, and Aphrodite. Still none could vanquish the mighty warrior Achilles individual in a duel, and that day Hector was defeated and killed. Still blinded by his hatred, Achilles dragged Hector's body behind his chariot and refused to return it to the Trojans for burial. King Priam of Troy was devastated by the loss of his favorite son, and afterwards was guided by Hermes, the messenger god, to Achilles' tent, where he begged for the return of Hector's body. Touched by the sorrow of a grieving father, Achilles agreed and gave back the body, so a funeral could be organized for Hector. But still the war raged on. Troy continued to resist even after the loss of their leader. In yet another battle, Achilles even managed once to enter the city with a small group of Achaeans. Seeing this, the gods gathered to argue over Achilles. He had killed so many, including many of their own children, that thought his time to die had come. Mortals, even heroes, are of little importance to the gods, and the gods agreed on this. Inspired by Apollo, Paris hit Achilles with a poisoned arrow in the only part of his body that could be injured, the spot his mother had not dipped in the river Styx, his heel. The hero Achilles vacillated as poison ran through his veins, and he collapsed, dead. On this day, the prophecy announcing that he would die young and become immortal through poetry was fulfilled. Achilles was no more, but 3,000 years later, he still lives in memories. With Achilles dead, the Greeks had lost their best hero, and the war was still not over. And the end came with one final ruse. And after years of fighting, violence, hate, and revenge, it was not force, but a ruse that ended it. Odysseus devised a ruse, a plan, that they would build a giant wooden horse in which he and a few others would hide. The Trojans awoke to find the beach deserted, the immense fleet of Greeks gone. The Achaeans had apparently withdrawn from the war, and only the giant horse on wheels remained on the beach. Believing the war to finally be over and filled with joy, the Trojans dragged the horse into their city. Several voices warned against keeping it, advising that the horse should instead be burned. But Athena made sure they were ignored. The Trojans decided to keep the horse as a trophy and turned to a night of celebration. To them, the war was finally over and they had prevailed. Or had they? Because in the middle of the night, when the moon was full, the Achaean fleet returned, and Odysseus and his men emerged from within the horse and killed the guards, and then opened the gates of Troy from the inside to the Greek army. The Greek army entered the city that night. They killed the sleeping population. The sack of Troy continued into the next day. Greeks were filled with rage after 10 years of pointless fighting. They committed a massacre and even threw Hector's infant, Astyanax, down from the walls of Troy to end the royal line. More innocents than before were killed, and the most powerful city of the world fell to its enemies. The story of Troy had come to an end, but history never ends. A few survivors, led by the Trojan hero Aeneas, went on a journey that ended in Italy, where they settled. Their story is told in another epic poem, the Aeneid, by the Roman author Virgil, who made the story of the Trojan horse legendary, as the horse doesn't appear in the Iliad, which actually ends before the fall of Troy. Greek kings returned to their lands on difficult journeys, especially Odysseus, whose journey home is told in Homer's Odyssey, that I will tell you another time. Through the Iliad and multiple other texts written later, the Trojan War remained continuously famous during antiquity, the Middle Ages, and to our days. In antiquity, the story was considered to be historical, but in the West, as it was considered to be part of mythology, it was increasingly seen as a myth, among others. In the 19th century, scholars considered Troy to be purely mythical, or as a story made of several different stories, until the 1860s, under the ruins of a Roman city, which itself had been built on a Greek settlement. The ruins of a large city from the Bronze Age corresponded to the location and time period indicated in the Iliad were discovered. And on the site, an abundance of artifacts made of copper, silver, and gold were unearthed. They have been called Priam's treasures, after the name of the legendary king of Troy. But most of the artifacts were actually located on a part of the site that doesn't correspond to the Bronze Age city. So it's far from certain whether or not these artifacts are related to ancient Troy, but still they are well preserved, ancient, and a remarkable archaeological treasure. So it appears Troy did exist in the Bronze Age. We still have no way of knowing whether the Trojan War is a myth, actually happened and was exaggerated, or was a combination of several wars. But what we do know is that a city existed there long before the dates of the supposed Trojan War. The ancient Greeks estimated the war to have taken place around 1200 BC, but the earliest excavated at the site are from 3000 BC, and archaeological studies indicate that the city was destroyed around the 12th century BC, at a time that corresponds to the mythical Trojan War story. More broadly, the dates correspond to a widespread phenomenon in the Near East called the Late Bronze Age Collapse, around the same time, between 1200 and 1150 BC. Ancient Greek kingdoms, Babylonia, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Egyptian Empire, they all collapsed politically and culturally at this time. Trade routes were interrupted, cities were abandoned, and the Dark Ages commenced, lingering for centuries in various parts of the eastern Mediterranean. We don't know the exact reason why. It could have been a temporary change in the climate. maybe caused by volcanic eruptions. It could have been an invasion or the effects of iron-based metallurgy that began to spread and maybe led to wars, or maybe a series of coincidences. But it happened, and maybe the story of the Trojan War was an expression of this collapse, which shook the early Greek world and from which the Greeks needed several centuries to fully recover. As always, mythology is never entirely made up and has its roots in reality as a way to explain history, society, and the human experience. So once upon a time, all the kings of Greece united in a war against the most powerful city in the world, Troy. For 10 long years, they besieged the city. The gods got involved in support of their champions. Countless warriors and many heroes fell on both sides. Finally, the Greeks vanquished the Trojans, in no small part thanks to a ploy imagined by the king of Ithaca. He instructed his troops to build a large hollow wooden horse in which Greek soldiers would hide, after which they would pretend to withdraw. They set their plan in motion and, blinded by the joy and relief that the war was finally over, though still worried as the gods had declared that Troy would fall, the Trojans dragged the horse inside their walls. That night, hundreds of Greek ships returned to the shore, and a small group of warriors led by Odysseus, who had remained hidden inside the horse, crept from their hiding place and slew the guards. They opened the city's doors from the inside, and that night they achieved, through trickery, what for 10 years force and bravery had failed to accomplish. Troy fell, defeated by a ruse. Some even said by a less than honorable strategy. But glory is always on the side of the victors, and the Greeks celebrated by looting and destroying the city that had resisted for so long. The Greeks had remained far from home for such a long time that all of them, warriors and kings alike, now wished only to return home to their wives and to their land. Each king, each captain, led their men home. Families were finally reunited after 10 long years of waiting. Following the end of the war, almost all Greek kings had returned, except one, Odysseus. As usual, I will tell you the episodes of the story, and in between we'll take a look at where they come from and what they meant to the ancient Greeks. What makes the Odyssey a singular work, and how a story that was put in writing almost 3,000 years ago still feels very contemporary, not because of the content itself, but rather because of its narrative structure. But let's return to our story, and before we find out where Odysseus was for all these years, we're going to make a first stop at Ithaca, which has changed a lot in his absence. In his small kingdom of Ithaca, his wife, Penelope, and son, Telemachus, who was still an infant when his father had gone to war, anxiously awaited a reunion with their husband and father. Odysseus had been missing for several years, and only the thinnest thread of hope remained that they would one day see him again. It turns out that Odysseus wasn't dead, and that his protector goddess Athena had not abandoned him, but that his journey home became one of the most extraordinary adventure tales ever told. And this is a story I'm going to share with you tonight. Long before the Trojan War, Odysseus had reigned over his island of Ithaca with his wife Penelope, a Spartan princess. He had fallen in love with her when in Sparta and brought her back with him to Ithaca. Years later, in the event that led to the Trojan War, Helen of Sparta was abducted by Paris of Troy. Her lawful husband, Menelaus, called upon the kings of Greece to defend his honor and retrieve his wife. Odysseus was one of those kings called upon, but he had no taste for adventure or war, especially so far from home. So he tried to avoid having to get involved by pretending he was crazy. When Menelaus's envoy arrived in Ithaca, Odysseus hooked a donkey and ox to his plow and started sowing his fields with salt. His ploy was quickly revealed as deception when one of his envoys placed Odysseus's infant, the young Telemachus, in front of the plow. Odysseus stopped in his tracks, thus exposing that he was only pretending to be insane. He was forced to follow the envoy into war against his will. And his example and attitude were contrary to many heroes of the time who were models of bravery and honor. Odysseus was more cautious. He wasn't a coward, and he knew how to take risks and when. Years later, he hid inside the Trojan horse. But Odysseus was also a family man, not an adventurer, and was deeply attached to his home and family. It would have deeply saddened him to know what transpired in Ithaca in his absence when he failed to return from the war. Several months after the war ended and other kings had returned, dozens of suitors from Ithaca had invaded Odysseus's place, where Penelope and Telemachus still lived. They wanted Penelope to acknowledge that her husband was dead, and each of them attempted to win her hand in marriage. These suitors couldn't even wait for confirmation of Odysseus's death to start stealing from him. They lived in his house, ate his cattle and harvest, and disrespected his wife by pressuring her to marry, becoming bolder and more insolent every day. By now, Telemachus was no longer an infant but a young man. He became more and more enraged each day by the impudence of these wannabe suitors, but didn't know what to do to restore order in his father's palace. Lucky for him and for Penelope, this was about to change. During these years, Odysseus enjoyed the protection of the goddess Athena. Thanks to her powers, she knew that Odysseus was still alive and why he had not returned home. It turns out that Odysseus had incurred the wrath of Poseidon, the god of the seas, during the Trojan War. Athena was firmly on the side of the Greeks, whereas other gods like Poseidon, Aphrodite, and Apollo supported the Trojans. And while these gods had had to accept the fall of Troy, some, like Poseidon, continued to hold a grudge against Odysseus. The Greek king was not only directly responsible for the fall of Troy, he had also achieved the defeat of Troy using a horse, and Poseidon was also the god of horses. One day, Poseidon left Mount Olympus, the residence of the gods, to accept a sacrifice far in the south, in Ethiopia. Athena took advantage of his absence to ask Zeus, the king of the gods, to finally allow Odysseus to return home. Zeus consented to it, and Athena immediately drew up plans to help the lost hero. At the time, Odysseus was being held captive on an island, had been for several years already, imprisoned against his will by Calypso, a nymph. But since his departure from Troy, and before his arrival at Calypso's island, Odysseus had lived through a series of extraordinary events. When the war ended, Odysseus left Troy with 12 ships, hoping to arrive in Ithaca a few weeks later. But his companions wanted to return home with more treasures that they had already looted from Troy, and insisted on launching a raid on Ismarus, a defenseless coastal city in Thrace, not far from the fresh ruins of Troy. Odysseus didn't like the idea, and he was eager to return home as soon as possible. But after 10 years of war, Odysseus's fellow warriors felt what they had pillaged from Troy was not enough of a prize. And so Odysseus finally agreed to the raid. The Greeks sacked Ismarus, divided their ill-gotten gains among themselves, and then, instead of leaving immediately, began to feast despite Odysseus urging everyone to depart. While at Ismarus, Odysseus had spared the life of a priest of Apollo and his family. To thank him, the priest gave him a bottle of black wine, some gold, and a mixing bowl. The wine was a strong and delicious drink. It was so concentrated that for each cup of wine, 20 times as much water needed to be added to dilute it. Odysseus didn't know what to do with this very special bottle of wine, but it could always be useful, so he held it in safekeeping. Tired from fighting and feasting, the Greeks fell asleep in the ruins of their excesses. So when the next morning, when the inhabitants of Ismarus returned with reinforcements, the looters were surprised and outnumbered by the angry crowd. They had to hastily escape, and Odysseus lost many men on the return to their ships and before continuing the journey to Ithaca. The god Poseidon watched all of this unfold, and he was determined to punish Odysseus for his role in the fall of Troy. Poseidon sent storms that drove the small fleet off course and scattered the 12 ships. After days spent fighting the elements, Odysseus's ships reached an island that could offer temporary shelter and allow them to make repairs before resuming their journey home. On this island, Odysseus and his fellows found an abundance of lush, wild vegetation, flowers, and appetizing nuts that resembled a natural garden. They soon encountered the island's inhabitants, who simply smiled and welcomed them and didn't seem particularly interested in asking where they came from. The Greek warriors observed that the island's residents spent their day almost exclusively sleeping and eating flowers and fruits from the magnificent tree at the center of the island. When asked what this tree was, the natives said it was the lotus tree, and that it provided everything they could ever wish for: a life of drowsiness, oblivion, and bliss. They offered flowers and fruits to Odysseus's companions, who soon joined the lotus eaters in their state of stupor. It turned out that, for generations, lost ships had stumbled upon this island and, partaking of the lotus tree, had forgotten about their previous lives, their loved ones, and their homes, and instead began living a permanent fugue state where nobody and nothing ever existed, where time was abolished and the past or the future no longer mattered. Odysseus understood the appeal and the danger of the lotus tree. The memory of his island, of Penelope and his son, Telemachus, were precious enough to his heart to renounce the bliss induced by the lotus tree. But all of his companions were now unconscious, and Odysseus had to carry them, one by one, back to the ships. When they woke up and begged for more flowers and fruits from the seductive lotus tree, Odysseus forced them to fast instead. The warriors wept. They soon recovered and remembered who they were. Odysseus asked his companions whether they would rather stay on the island with the lotus eaters and forget everything, or return home. As the effects of the drug were now fading, the warriors decided to leave, and the expedition resumed its journey. As we have already talked about in previous stories about mythology, and how mythological tales in ancient Greek society often served as more than just entertainment. In this case, the story is obviously meant to serve as a cautionary tale against addiction, and beyond that, as an invitation to reflect on what remains of your humanity if you decide to renounce your memory and abdicate all responsibility. Is the ability to stop suffering, stop caring, however appealing, a fair trade for your humanity? The story of the Lotus Eaters presents the wish for oblivion as a death wish. Obliterating everything that makes one human is a form of death, though not a biological one. Escaping everything that makes us human, including suffering, means essentially disappearing and makes us as good as dead to others. The temptation to live as a zombie can be, oddly, highly seductive, and rejecting this escape from reality is not easy or immediately gratifying. It's hard and uncomfortable. It takes resilience, but at least for Odysseus, it will be worth it in the end because the story has a happy ending, but not before experiencing trials and suffering. These concepts of self-control, moderation, and responsibility were highly praised and valued in classical Greek culture, and were some of the qualities expected from citizens. To an extent, they are universal because They are necessary to make any society work. But Greek literature is innovative in that it is one of the first examples in the world of intellectual works that integrates these values into storytelling, building tales around moral concepts. Another innovation specific to the Odyssey is its narrative structure. It's a poem, like the Iliad, and it recounts a short period of time at the end of the Trojan War. Both are very long poems. The Odyssey, for example, has more than 12,000 lines. The poem, as I mentioned earlier, was probably intended to be heard rather than read, but as a work of literature, it looks more like a modern novel than an ancient poem. Employing modern structural devices, the plot is nonlinear. There are flashbacks, elements that fill the blanks of the story of the Trojan War, as told in the Iliad. The account of the Trojan horse, for example, was not in the Iliad, and we only learn about it in the Odyssey from Odysseus. But the Odyssey has a way of keeping people on the edge of their seats. It doesn't begin as a linear storyline when Odysseus leaves Troy. It begins instead in Ithaca, 10 years after the end of the Trojan War, and we learn then about the situation of the island with Odysseus's wife Penelope, the invasion of her palace by suitors. Athena intervenes to help Odysseus return home. We learn later that he is kept prisoner by the nymph Calypso on her island. Calypso has to free him because Zeus sends the messenger of the gods, Hermes, to order her to do so after Athena has pleaded on Odysseus's behalf. Odysseus escapes, which I will tell you more about later, and reaches another island where he is offered hospitality and tells the story of his escapades since he left Troy. So we learn about earlier events through his account and the bulk of the Odyssey. All of Odysseus's adventures and misadventures as he attempted to return home unfolds as what we would call a series of flashbacks. It is a story within a story, and Odysseus is the narrator of our story tonight. I am taking all the elements from the Odyssey, but not telling them in the exact order they appear in the poem. If I had, you would have waited another half hour long before hearing about any of Odysseus's actual adventures. Instead, I am going to follow the two main plot lines in parallel. One that happens in the present of the narration, 10 years after Odysseus's disappearance, when we find him on Calypso's island, and one that happened in the past, the series of adventures he went through during those 10 intervening years. The two plot lines join when Odysseus returns to Ithaca to claim his throne. As we discussed earlier, Athena obtained the liberation of her favorite hero from the island of Calypso, but she also wanted him to return home and retake his throne. After visiting Zeus to secure Odysseus' freedom, she herself went to Ithaca. The goddess disguised herself as a chieftain from the island of Taphos. The Taphians were renowned sea travelers and sometimes pirates who knew a lot about what happened at sea. Athena, as a chieftain, visited Telemachus to urge him to leave the island in search of his father. Unaware that he was talking to a mighty goddess, Telemachus offered the chieftain hospitality, and that night Athena saw firsthand how the various would-be suitors imposed upon and disrespected the lawful queen and prince of Ithaca in the absence of Odysseus. That night Athena changed her appearance again, from the chieftain disguised to look now like Telemachus, and she found a ship and a crew for the true prince. The next day she convinced Telemachus to depart to the mainland to start searching for his father. Athena changed her appearance yet again, this time in the guise of Mentor, a wise and old man who had been charged by Odysseus to educate Telemachus and join Telemachus in his journey. Unaware that he was accompanied by Athena herself and not the real Mentor, Telemachus set sail for the Greek main island with the intention of visiting the most venerated surviving Greek warrior from the Trojan War, Nestor. Nestor was already old when the Trojan War began, but he had bravely led the armies of his kingdom, Pylus, and had helped Greek warriors with his sage guidance. But Nestor didn't know where Odysseus was, and unfortunately couldn't help. After his visit to Nestor, Telemachus traveled to Sparta to talk to King Menelaus and his wife Helen, who were now reconciled. You may recall that Helen had been kidnapped by Paris and taken to Troy, and it was to recover his wife that King Menelaus had started the Trojan War. But Helen was not herself when she had followed Paris to Troy. She had been the victim of a fit of lust brought on by Aphrodite. Menelaus and Helen told Telemachus that their voyage back from Troy had also been long and difficult. They had gone to Egypt during their travels back to Sparta, and there, on the island of Pharos, Menelaus had encountered an old god of the sea, Proteus. And Proteus had told Menelaus that Odysseus had gone through many hardships on his voyage home, and was now a captive of the nymph Calypso on her island. Telemachus was sad to learn how hard it had been for his father, but was also overjoyed to realize that his father was still alive. Learning the news, Telemachus was assured that his hope of seeing his father again had been justified. However, the suitors in Odysseus's palace soon realized that Telemachus had escaped from Ithaca, and angry that they had let it happen, they formulated a plan to ambush his ship when he returned. Telemachus and Penelope's trials were substantial, but Odysseus and his men had suffered through much more significant ordeals since their departure from Troy 10 years earlier. They had narrowly escaped the vengeful inhabitants of Ismarus and the seductive trap of the Lotus Eaters. But it seemed to them that, after so much danger, their luck was turning. They approached a new island that looked welcoming, and which was a perfect place to rest and find food. What they didn't know, unfortunately, was that this island belonged to the Cyclopes. The Cyclopes were one-eyed giants, by which I mean they each had only one eye in the center of their foreheads. They lived in the world of men, but not among them. The location of their land was unknown, and many even doubted their existence, but they were real. They lived like men did before they became civilized. They were shepherds with herds of giant sheep, but had no agriculture, no wine, and they lived in caves. Their father was Poseidon, the god of the seas, who responded to that which displeased him with blind fury. The Cyclopes were savages. They slaughtered and ate all who came to their land, and they lived solitary lives with no interest in knowing anything about the world. Odysseus and his companions were oblivious to the danger they faced, not knowing that they had landed close to the lair of a Cyclops, a terrifying giant named Polyphemus. In their search for provisions, Odysseus, along with a group of men, found the entrance to the Cyclopes' lair. Looking in the cave, they found more cheese and meat than they could ever have dreamed of finding. But as they were celebrating their good fortune, Polyphemus returned to the cave with his flock. Having entered his cave to find unwanted visitors, Polyphemus sealed its entrance with a great stone, ignoring the rules of hospitality and seizing the opportunity to eat something new. He called over two of the men and promptly ate them. He then fell asleep, and Odysseus and the surviving men spent the rest of the night hiding and trembling, unable to escape the cave as the entrance was blocked by a rock so large that no man could ever move it. In the morning, the giant Cyclops killed and ate two more men before leaving the cave to tend to his sheep. Still unable to escape the cave, Odysseus and his men spent the day thinking of possible ways to flee, but the situation seemed hopeless, and they figured it was only a matter of time before the Cyclops would kill and eat them all. After Polyphemus returned in the evening and ate two more men, Odysseus finally had an idea. He offered the Cyclops some of the strong and undiluted wine that he had received as a gift earlier from the priest of Apollo, whose life he had spared in Ismarus. The Cyclops didn't know what wine was, and Polyphemus soon grew drunk and careless. He asked Odysseus his name and promised a gift if he answered. Odysseus told him his name was Nobody, and as a reward, Polyphemus only promised to eat nobody last of all. And with that, he fell into a drunken sleep. But Odysseus was not one to stand still and wait for death. During the time spent plotting their escape from the cave, Odysseus had hardened a wooden stake in the fire. So when the giant fell asleep, Odysseus was ready and drove the stake into the Cyclops' eye. Distraught and blinded, Cyclops called for help, and his brothers who lived in other caves on the island soon arrived. When they asked Polyphemus what had happened, he told them that nobody had heard him, and so they naturally thought Polyphemus was being afflicted by a fit of madness. They recommended he pray and rest. In the morning, before leading his sheep out to graze, the blind Cyclops felt their backs so as to be sure none of the men escaped as he left the cave. However, Odysseus and his men had tied themselves to the underside of the animals and so got away without the giant noticing. They ran to their ships and sailed off. But as soon as they left the shore, Odysseus, who was too proud of his intelligence, committed an act of hubris and revealed his real name. The giant heard him and cast huge rocks towards Odysseus's ship, which barely missed hitting them. Worse than the rocks, Polyphemus also prayed to his father Poseidon for revenge. Poseidon was already angry at Odysseus. He would now be furious. Before we continue with the stories of his many adventures, let's take a look at Odysseus himself. To the Greeks, Odysseus was maybe the most popular of all heroes. He is different from most of the others. All Greek heroes are role models of some kind, but they are not all the same. They have different personalities, and they also have flaws, alongside some outstanding talents. Some may be extraordinary warriors, who have also a whimsical or bad character, like Achilles as presented in the Iliad. Some are reckless or commit horrible crimes, like Heracles, who killed his wife and children in a fit of rage. In the case of Odysseus, the quality that stands out most is his intelligence. He embodies various definitions of the word. He comprehends things quickly. He anticipates things. He's also able to trick others. But this intelligence also has its limits. Odysseus doesn't always anticipate the consequences of his actions, like when he angers the gods or when he reveals his real name to the Cyclops. He likes to brag, and like anyone else who claims to be smart, the claim itself reveals the limits of his intelligence. He fails to understand how he is going to be perceived by others, and his lack of self-awareness. This pride can lead to hubris. That is to say, the Greeks felt that an excess of self-confidence could also lead to excessive pride or defiance towards the gods and bring disaster. This is a serious flaw, and one of several other characteristics that make Odysseus a human hero. He's not particularly brave. He pretends to be insane to avoid the Trojan War. But he is also loyal. He loves his wife, his son, his land, and in Greek mythology, be it in the Iliad or the Odyssey, or any of the other stories in the same cycle, Odysseus is on the right side, the side of the Greeks, the side we are invited to root for. He is presented as likable in the Greek tradition. But later, when the Romans adopted many Greek myths and added their own, they turned him into a villain, focusing on the less honorable aspects of the character. To the Romans, who Romanized many names, he was Ulysses. The Romans knew the Odyssey, they studied it and appreciated it. But in their culture, many of his actions, the tricks and strategies he employed, his attempt to avoid his sacred oath to defend Menelaus and Helen and not join the Trojan War, all of this offended their notion of honor and duty. It depended somewhat on the period of time or the author, but in general, the Romans were more rigid and more strict about these values in comparison with the Greeks, who had a more nuanced view of them and could appreciate a good trickster. The Roman rejection of Odysseus or Ulysses culminated in the Aeneid, which is a Latin epic poem written in the 1st century BC modeled after the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Aeneid is less universally famous than the Odyssey, but the story itself is really creative and really interesting. It's a mythical retelling of the origins of Rome that follows the travel of Aeneas, one of the Trojan heroes from the Iliad. But instead of dying when Troy falls, Aeneas escapes a long journey to Italy, where he became the first Roman. The Aeneid makes the Romans the descendants of the Trojans, acknowledging their connection to Greek civilization while also drawing a distinct line between the two societies. As a key player in the fall of Troy, with the Trojan horse trick, Odysseus appears as a villain in the Aeneid and is constantly referred to as cruel or deceitful. The Aeneid was written by Virgil, a poet, at the time of the fall of the Republic, when Rome became an empire and expanded faster than ever. At the time, educated people were probably well aware that the Aeneid was not history and was just a work of fiction made to cement a Roman myth. But Odysseus, as a result, took on the image of a villain with an antagonist. It was centuries before his reputation, his character, and the general positive impression we have of him nowadays were restored. Now let's resume our story. Odysseus had foolishly boasted and revealed his real name to the Cyclops. He could avoid the rocks the giant threw, but not the curse of Poseidon. The Cyclops prayed to his father, Poseidon, and asked him to curse Odysseus, to curse him to wander the sea for 10 years, during which time he would lose all of his crew. Following their escape from the land of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus and his men reached the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, near the island of Sicily. He and his men had narrowly escaped death from the Cyclops, but they also hadn't found the supplies they desperately needed. So, as soon as they saw another island where they could anchor, they decided to make a stop. The island was not on any map because it was a floating island, and it belonged to King Aeolus, a powerful but benevolent man whom the gods had made keeper of the winds. Even though he wasn't a god, his control of the winds and his dominion over the surface of the seas gave the keeper of the winds power and wealth enough to rival Poseidon himself. King Aeolus greeted Odysseus and gave him and his crew hospitality for a month. The keeper of the winds appreciated Odysseus and decided to help him return home, telling our hero that he would provide his ship with the exact wind it needed to deliver them back to Ithaca. And he gave Odysseus a large leather bag that contained all the winds, minus the gentle west winds, a gift that would ensure a quick and safe return home. Rested and optimistic, the Greeks returned to their ships after thanking King Aeolus and set sail for their island. As promised by the keeper of the winds, the journey was fast and even, and Ithaca appeared on the horizon after just a few days. Relieved but exhausted, Odysseus fell asleep, dreaming of his coming reunion with Penelope and his home. But his men were intrigued by the leather bag, and thought it contained a treasure given by King Aeolus. If it was gold, it was only fair that they receive their share. And so, as Odysseus slept, they opened the bag to reveal its contents. All at once, all of the winds flew out, and a violent storm drove the ship away from Ithaca. After hours of stormy conditions during which they could not control their ship, Odysseus and his foolish companions realized they had once again arrived at the floating island of Aeolus. King Aeolus believed that this was a sign that Odysseus had drawn the ire of the gods upon himself, and afraid to displease the gods, he refused to help again. Empty-handed and still followed by the wrath of Poseidon, Odysseus had to leave the island. The men re-embarked, and on their next stop, once again, faced cannibalistic giants, though not cyclopes this time, but a tribe of man-eating giants who had sprung from the son of Poseidon, Lestrigon. For this reason they were known as Lestrigonans. As soon as Odysseus sailed close to the coast of their island, they attacked with rocks, and the king of Ithaca once again narrowly escaped death while losing many of his companions. His ship was severely damaged, and as they limped along their journey, almost grounded on the beach of another island where a new, dangerous fate awaited them. The island belonged to Circe, an ancient sorceress. Circe was a daughter of the god of the sun, Helios, and was renowned for her vast knowledge of potions and herbs, and for her terrifying magic powers. She lived in a palace far from any human presence, in the midst of a dense wood, surrounded by lions, wolves, and many other animals, all of which were surprisingly docile. But Circe's island hid a terrible secret. Using her beautiful singing voice, Circe attracted travelers to her island and then invited them to a feast. At the feast, she would then drug them with potions that made her unfortunate victims shapeshift into animals. The lions and wolves living around Circe's place were, in reality, men who had the misfortune of crossing her path. But nobody knew, as no one had ever escaped the island to share Circe's terrible secret. When Odysseus and his crew landed on the island, most of the men set off to explore it, while their leader stayed on the ship. The crew met Circe, who naturally invited them to a feast that the hungry sailors could not resist. Of course, Circe had already mixed one of her magical potions into the dishes, and all of Odysseus's crew turned into pigs. The only man to escape becoming a swine was Odysseus's second in command, Eurylochus, who had remained cautious and not touched the food. Eurylochus returned to the ship and informed Odysseus, who immediately went on a rescue mission. He walked to the palace, but before he reached it, the messenger of the gods, Hermes, appeared, sent by Athena. Hermes revealed to Odysseus how Circe could be defeated, and gave Odysseus an herb that would protect him from the effects of her potions. Hermes recommended that Odysseus draw his sword and force Circe to swear that she would not take any further actions against him. Odysseus, following these instructions, was able to force the powerful enchantress to free his men. The crew was changed into human beings again and, exhausted, needed to rest, as did Odysseus. But despite what she had done, Odysseus couldn't help but notice that Circe was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen, almost rivaling the legendary beauty of Helen of Sparta. The men's stay on the island lasted another 10 days, then 10 weeks, and finally, as Odysseus began to share Circe's bed, months that extended to an entire year. Odysseus was still homesick, and the charms of Circe had still not erased his memory of Penelope. One day, he resolved to leave the ancient sorceress and resume his journey. Circe, who knew the hearts of men and could see glimpses of the future, was not surprised. So she did not oppose Odysseus' decision, but instead instructed him that, in order to return to Ithaca, he would first have to visit the underworld. The entrance to the underworld was in the west, where the sun goes to die every evening before it reappears in the east every morning. Guided by Circe's instructions, Odysseus and his crew crossed the Mediterranean Sea far, far to the west, near the Pillars of Heracles that marked the end of the world and the beginning of an endless ocean. They reached a harbor at the western edge of the world, where Odysseus sacrificed to the dead. Darkness fell around him, and suddenly Odysseus found himself in an unknown wasteland where the ghosts of the dead wandered aimlessly. He first encountered the spirit of one of his crewmen, Elpenor, who had died on Circe's island. Elpenor had fallen off a roof and his body had not been found. He asked for Odysseus to find and bury his remains, which Odysseus promised to do. He then summoned the spirit of Tiresias, a prophet of Apollo, who had died long before and was famous for his clairvoyance. Odysseus asked the spirit how to appease Poseidon, and the prophet told him that one day he and his crew would reach an island where Helios, the sun god, kept his sacred livestock. If they refrained from eating the animals, then he may return home. But a failure to do so would result in the loss of his ship and his entire crew. Next, Odysseus met the spirit of his dead mother. She had died of grief during his long absence, and it was from her he first heard about his household and the suitors who threatened his family with their greed and insolence. Odysseus stayed and talked to the spirit of his fallen companions, like Agamemnon and Achilles, until the fog around him began to dissipate. A ray of sunshine pierced the darkness, then 2, then 3, and he realized that he had left the underworld and returned to the world of the living. The entire crew returned to Circe's island and, as promised, searched for the remains of Elpenor, the fallen crewman. and buried him. They said goodbye to Circe, who gave them enough food to continue their journey. However, leaving Circe's island to the east would force them to skirt to the land of the Sirens, who were some of the most dangerous monsters in the entire world. The Sirens were not terrifying creatures who threatened sailors with sharp teeth and claws, but with their voices. The Sirens were half women, half birds, and attracted nearby sailors with their enchanting music and singing voices. Voices so seductive that no man could resist their allure. Ships would constantly try to approach the rocky coasts of their island and be shipwrecked, even though sailors knew that answering the song of the Sirens was deadly. Odysseus had a plan to survive the Sirens and ordered his crewmen to plug their ears with beeswax. But he himself was too curious to resist the temptation to hear the enchanting song of the Sirens. So he asked his men to tie him to the mast and to not untie him under any circumstance. As the ship approached the Sirens' island, Odysseus heard their song, and his will was instantly annihilated. All he could think of was to jump into the sea and swim toward the Sirens. Luckily for Odysseus, his men respected and followed his orders, and their ears plugged with beeswax couldn't hear him begging to be untied. So the ship successfully passed the island without any losses. But this region of the sea was full of dangers. The ship now had to pass through a narrow channel of water where two deadly threats awaited sailors. On one side, Scylla, a six-headed monster, was ready to capture any passing ship and smash it to pieces. On the other side, within an hour's distance, was Charybdis, a powerful whirlpool that sank any vessel that got too close. The only way to avoid one of these dangers was to pass too close to the other, and most ships attempting to cross the channel ended up destroyed. Only a very difficult, extremely narrow path lay between the two, which allowed for safe passage. Odysseus and his crew had no choice but to risk it. As they entered the channel, the waters became agitated, and Scylla's 6 heads ventured dangerously close to the ship. At one point, Scylla did manage to snatch up 6 men, who died crushed between its toes, but the convoy of ships finally crossed successfully and soon arrived in quieter waters. Soon, on the horizon appeared the island of Helios. This was the island where the sun god kept his livestock that Odysseus had been strictly instructed by Tiresias to not eat no matter what. Odysseus wanted to stay away from the island, but his crew was becoming more and more unruly after so many ordeals, and they decided to override his orders. The ship landed on the island, and the crew, who had been given so much food by Circe, promised Odysseus that they would not even look at Helios's livestock, and that they would resume their journey very soon. But the gods were watching. the desperate attempts of his crew to return home, and had grown angry at Odysseus. Not only had he displeased Poseidon at Troy, and then further offended him by blinding his Cyclops son, but Odysseus had also defied the gods by receiving help from the Keeper of the Winds, and had just had a bit too much luck in escaping so many dangers. And because the gods were cruel and liked to play with the lives of men, Zeus caused a storm to prevent the crew from leaving the island, a storm that never seemed to end. Days passed. Odysseus spent his time praying to the gods, hoping to appease them. The crew needed to eat and had already depleted the supplies given to them by Circe. After days spent fasting, the men grew unbearably hungry. They ignored the orders of Odysseus, who was away praying, and they hunted the sacred cattle of Helios. The sun god was infuriated and asked Zeus to punish the crew. In response, Zeus suspended the war, letting the men think that they could now live. But as soon as they tried to once again depart, the storm resumed, stronger than ever. The ship was out of control as the storm drove it towards Charybdis, the monstrous whirlpool. Their ship crumbled as it entered the whirlpool. Only Odysseus was able to grab the branches of a fig tree that hung above Charybdis, and as he clung to the tree, he watched in horror as the last of his companions drowned, and their bodies and the remains of their ships were sucked into the black abyss. Odysseus was now alone. His ship was lost. All of his men were dead. They had eaten the cattle of Helios, and the prophecy was now fulfilled. Our hero was now more alone and more desperate than ever. Odysseus floated out the sea, waiting for death to take him, as all hope had now vanished. He had seen too much, lost too much, was too exhausted to cry and too broken to find a reason to live. But it was written that life still had more in store for Odysseus. And so it was that he washed ashore on yet another island where the nymph Calypso lived. The nymph cared for Odysseus and healed his body, but not his heart, as only his wife Penelope and his homeland could bring him any peace. Days passed, and his strength returned. Calypso made him her lover, but he didn't feel anything. Weeks passed, then months, and without a ship or any idea where he was, there was no possibility of escape. The months added up until Odysseus had been a prisoner on the island for 2 years. After the years of excitement, of danger and action, his life turned to boredom, homesickness, and desperation. 7 years passed. Odysseus had lost all track of time and didn't even realize that it had been nearly 10 years since his departure from Troy. Nor did he remember that Poseidon's curse, after Odysseus blinded the Cyclops, was nearing its end, and that he still had an ally on Mount Olympus, Athena. As we saw at the beginning of our story, Odysseus' son, Telemachus, was now an adult. He had received a visit from Athena in disguise, who guided him to the mainland to investigate his father's whereabout. Athena also convinced Zeus to send the messenger of God, Hermes, to Calypso's island to instruct her to release her prisoner. Calypso had no choice but to accept. She gave Odysseus a small boat and let him go. He sailed a few days without seeing anyone before reaching an island where friendly locals showed him hospitality. They recognized the new arrival as the king of Ithaca, whose legend, after the Trojan War and subsequent mysterious 10 years disappearance, was now established. Odysseus recounted all that had happened to him, and as they learned all the dramatic details of his incredible journey, they resolved to help him. That night, when Odysseus slept, the locals defied Poseidon's curse and swiftly conveyed him to the shores of his homeland. In the morning, Odysseus awoke on an unknown beach. Alone and disoriented, Athena appeared to him and revealed that he was back in his land, back to Ithaca. But she tempered his elation by explaining that he would have to fight to take back his home from the suitors and the traitors who had disrespected his house and family. Athena disguised Odysseus as an elderly beggar, so he would be able to see for himself how things stood in his household. Meanwhile, Telemachus returned from his visit to Sparta, and the father and son were secretly reunited in the home of one of Odysseus's old slaves, who had remained loyal to his master. Still disguised as a beggar, Odysseus went to his palace and saw his wife again for the first time in 20 years, but also witnessed firsthand how the suitors exploited his wealth and humiliated Penelope. But Athena was still working behind the scenes, and the next day she inspired Penelope to announce to the suitors that they would finally be able to compete for her hand. There would be an archery competition using Odysseus's bow. This bow was famously hard to string and required uncommon strength that few men possessed. Penelope announced that the man who was able to string the bow and shoot an arrow through a dozen aligned axe heads would win. The competition began in the palace's hall, with the suitors eager to show their talent and prowess. Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, watched the scene unfold. One after another, the suitors failed to shoot an arrow through the axe heads, until at last the unknown beggar stepped forward and offered to try. The suitors laughed, but Odysseus, in disguise, took up the bow and shot, sending the arrow right through the 12 axe heads. He then started shooting at the killers, killing them methodically with his bow and arrows. Inspired by Athena, Telemachus and other servants joined him, and ferociously fight ensued until no suitors were left. When it was over, Odysseus removed his beggar's clothes and identified himself to Penelope. Penelope was hesitant at first, not recognizing this man who stood in front of her, so changed by time. But when he mentioned that he had made their bed from an olive tree that was still rooted to the ground, Penelope knew this man was her beloved Odysseus. After a decade of war, then another battling to return home, Odysseus was finally reunited with his family. The simple happiness he had been longing for 20 years, the pleasures of home and hearth, had finally been granted. All's well that ends well. Long ago, there was a time when all humans were male. There were no women, and men lived naked and uncivilized around the world. Humans were weak compared to many wild animals. They had no fur to keep them warm, and no thick skin for protection. They weren't equipped with large teeth or the ability to fly to escape. Then one day, the Titan Prometheus decided to intervene on behalf of these fragile beings. Prometheus stole the secret of fire from the gods and gifted it to humanity. This marked a great advantage for men, one that surpassed any advantage bestowed upon other species. The gift of fire provided not only comfort and protection, but also sparked the first step towards the acquisition of knowledge and the taming of nature. With these came culture and civilization. The gift of fire was a spark of divinity given to men. For this theft, the fire awarded to men as a gift, Prometheus was harshly punished. This is a story of the king of gods, Zeus, and how he enchanted revenge on Prometheus. But he still wasn't satisfied. Humanity, too, had to face the consequences, or at least be restrained. They couldn't be entrusted solely with the newfound knowledge of fire, something that would undoubtedly multiply their power in the future and perhaps lead them to defy the gods one day. Sometimes Zeus preferred swift and brutal revenge, but at other times he relished devising intricate schemes that would gradually unfold. This time he chose the latter. Humanity would be punished, but this punishment would be the consequences of their own actions, and they would eventually diminish into oblivion. For the first phase of this plan, Zeus approached Hephaestus, the craftsman and black goldsmith god who lived in seclusion, away from most of the other gods. His own mother, Hera, had thrown him off Mount Olympus, the abode of the gods, because of his lameness. Therefore, Hephaestus turned to work in his workshop, keenly interested in the adventures and quarrels of other gods. He crafted equipment for them, objects that were as perfect and beautifully made as he was deemed unattractive. These items included the winged helmet and sandals of Hermes, the messenger gods, and the chariot of Helios, the sun god. Zeus sought out the reclusive Hephaestus and requested that he sculpt a new creature, a human woman. The first woman ever was created from clay. Hephaestus modeled the body, and life was breathed into it. Humans were not created to be perfect, and how could this be when they were brought into existence by gods who were themselves imperfect? However, an effort was made for this first woman, or so it seemed. Each god contributed by bestowing her with unique gifts: beauty, intelligence, eloquence, and strength. She received all these qualities and was named Pandora, the all-gifted. However, these gifts were ambivalent and double-edged, and this ambiguity was part of Zeus's plan. Hermes endowed Pandora with intelligence and eloquence. But alongside these gifts, the messenger god also infused her with a shameless mind and a deceitful nature. Notably, Hermes gave Pandora the ability to lie convincingly. Aphrodite, in turn, blessed Pandora with grace and attractiveness, causing men to lose their senses and judgment in her presence. Thus Pandora emerged as a creature who was as beautiful and intelligent as she was dangerous and unpredictable. This was the devastating weapon that Zeus had meticulously crafted to diminish and punish men. Once his creation was complete, the king of gods approached Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, offering Pandora to him as his wife. Before he was punished and chained to a mountain for bringing fire to humanity, Prometheus had warned his brother, warned him to never accept a gift from Zeus, because he knew the king of gods never gave away favors and gifts without hidden motives. Epimetheus was charmed by Pandora and forgot about his brother's warning. He accepted her. As a parting gift, Zeus had given Pandora a large jar, a pithos, in which the god had put different plagues. Some were physical, like storms, diseases, or earthquakes. Others were material or emotional, like fear, desperation, or delusion. The supreme god was confident that Pandora's nature would ensure the rest. He believed that she would soon disseminate these plagues because she would carelessly open the jar. Unable to resist the temptation to do so, simply because she could, and he was correct. Soon, despite being instructed not to open the jar, Pandora became curious about its contents. She was unable to resist the temptation for long. As soon as she opened the jar, all the plagues it contained proliferated around the world and began to afflict her species. Though she rushed to close the container, only one thing was left behind, usually translated as hope, though it could also have the pessimistic meaning of deceptive expectation. The story I just told you is one of the most famous versions of the Greek myth, and we owe it to Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet. Thought to have been active between the 8th and the 7th centuries BC, he was a contemporary to Homer, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like with Homer, it is uncertain whether Hesiod actually existed as a single individual, or if he was a pseudo-author, a name to which different works were attributed. You have certainly heard of the term Pandora's box. This is what the figure of Pandora is most famous for. To open Pandora's box means to unleash disasters out of carelessness or an excess of curiosity, resulting in irreversible actions. These calamities or consequences, once released, are here to stay. They are like toothpaste. Once out, they won't go back into the tube. The origin of the phrase lies in ancient times, but in all ancient versions of the myth, as written by Hesiod and later retold by Greek and Roman authors, it was not a box that was open, but a pithos. that is to say, a kind of large amphora, a container that was used for storage. The concept transformed into a box much later, around the time of the Renaissance, 2,000 years after the earliest known written versions of the story. This came about when pithos was translated to box, and the term lived on. However, this is a technical detail that does not alter the fundamental implication of the story. There is a lot to unpack in this myth. At the surface level, it serves as a cautionary tale about careless actions. Moreover, it represents an attempt to explain or make sense of the presence of evil in the world, delving deep into the human condition. You might have also noticed the familiar storyline of the first woman created after the first man, who inadvertently lets evil into the world, driven by impulses she cannot control. This narrative bears a striking resemblance to the story from the Hebrew and the Christian Bibles, where Eve accepts a gift that leads to the expulsion of humanity from Eden, marking the end of her golden age and rendering it forever irretrievable. Another aspect that deserves discussion is that the figure of Pandora is not confined to just this one myth. Greek myths about Pandora exist in different versions, some of which are contradictory. Additionally, Pandora was also the name of an ancient goddess or mythical being. As you see, there are many facets to this ostensibly simple story, and we're going to approach them one by one. Like many myths, the story of Pandora invites various interpretations or can be examined from different perspectives. First, there is the most obvious one, the cautionary tale, warning about the consequences of acting carelessly, which can lead to irreversible tragic outcomes. Pandora opens the jar, and the world is forever changed, plagued by afflictions that persist to this day. Now, diving a bit deeper, the tale also explains the presence of evil or suffering in the world, a common function of myths. They seek to make sense of or provide a backstory for phenomena that affects humanity. This particular story can be seen as an example of theodicity. What does theodicity mean? The term theodicity is used in philosophy of religion and was coined in the 18th century by a German philosopher, Leibniz. Derived from Greek, it literally translates to vindication of God. The problem that puzzled theologians and philosophers of the time, and even before that, was the problem of evil. How can we reconcile the existence of a God who is all-powerful, benevolent, and omniscient, with the reality of evil and suffering that persists in the world and in human lives? In other words, why would a God or gods who are all-powerful and wish us well allow such things to exist? Theodicity is an argument, or in some cases a backstory, that attempts to reconcile these seemingly incompatible aspects. In many mythologies, there exist one or several stories that explain how evil and pain came to spread across the world, typically marking the end of a mythical golden age, a period of peace and prosperity devoid of suffering, which supposedly existed prior to these events. For many ancient civilizations, like the classical Greece, the presence of evil in the world did not necessarily conflict with their perception of the divine or their concept of gods. They did not believe that their gods were omnipotent or omniscient. In many Greek mythological stories, gods hide information from each other and sometimes act out of ignorance. Moreover, they are not perceived as always benevolent. They could certainly punish humans, even unfairly at times. They had very human passions and desires. In the case of ancient Greece, the Olympian gods were not the creators of the world. They merely resided in it. These gods happened to possess powers and were eternal, but they were not the creators of the universe. As such, to the Greeks, the gods themselves were subject to pain and emotions. They could be petty, cruel, whimsical, and prone to mistakes. The coexistence of these gods with suffering and evil in the world was not theoretically problematic for the ancient Greeks. However, the existence of these myths still indicates a need for backstory, an explanation for why plagues and suffering afflict mankind. In fact, the myth of Pandora's box explains the spread of plagues as a very intentional plan devised by Zeus. It's a punishment, a form of revenge against humanity, designed to humble it. If there is a moral message here, it would likely emphasize the need for humanity to submit to divine decisions and to the forces of nature. These forces made plagues an inseparable part of our human condition. They came from above and should be accepted as such. The problem of evil appears more theoretically complex for subsequent religions, particularly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that operate on the belief in a single God. This God is all-powerful, responsible for creating the world we inhabit, for creating mankind, and is also benevolent. Philosophers and theologians from these varying traditions have analyzed this problem and constructed arguments. The Odysseys, which strive to reconcile a benevolent God and an all-powerful God with the reality of evil. These theodicies can argue that evil or suffering are part of a broader plan working towards a greater good, or that the existence of evil is both a consequence of and a prerequisite for the free will of humans. Different versions of this argument exist, but they generally converge on the following point. Genuine liberty or free will for humans is impossible without the freedom to commit evil or to disregard God's commandments. Hence, eliminating evil would rob humans of their freedom. This is the essence of theodicity, and the myth of Pandora, as told by Hesiod, is one of the most ancient theories we know of. Returning to more historical considerations, the complex character of Pandora was not Hesiod's invention. Evidence suggests that she was an ancient figure in Greek mythology, existing long before Hesiod rendered the myth in the form I previously outlined. After him, the story was rewritten and adapted many times throughout antiquity. Hesiod utilized a mythological character who, in earlier versions of the myth, was sometimes married to Prometheus, not his brother Epimetheus. In these earlier versions, the jar may have contained only good things for humans. In such context, Pandora would have been a benevolent female, counterpart to Prometheus. The husband stole fire from the gods to give to mankind, with fire serving as a metaphor for knowledge and culture, while the wife, Pandora, distributed blessings to humankind. What supports the existence of this earlier myth is that Pandora's name can mean all gifted, as previously mentioned. but it can also be interpreted as all-giving. Both interpretations are compatible with these two versions of the myth, which present her in starkly different roles. Adding weight to the argument for a benevolent Pandora is the fact that she was depicted on ancient artifacts, like pottery, under an alternative name, Anisidora, which translates to she who sends gifts. Therefore, historians believe that while Hesiod's version of the myth has survived through the centuries and is now completely associated with Pandora, ancient Greeks may not have universally viewed her as a negative figure. The two versions of the myth might have coexisted, varying across different periods or regions of the Greek world. An additional observation to note is the strong and overtly misogynistic undertone in Hesiod's story. In summary, the creation of the first woman was framed by Zeus as punishment. Before her, there were only men, and humanity was content. The first woman is portrayed as the individual who introduced disaster. Hesiod's story acknowledges Pandora's qualities, but it insinuates that she cannot be trusted due to her lack of control and reason, compounded by her deceitful nature. She may just be a character, but as the first woman, she clearly also represents an archetype. This makes for an extreme case in Greek mythology. There are many feminine figures in Greek mythology painted in a more positive light. Goddesses like Athena or Aphrodite are generally represented as positive characters, often supporting the heroes we are encouraged to root for. Another archetype is Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who is a model of virtue and loyalty. There are also powerful women, like the Amazons, who are warriors. It would be misleading to label every single flaw attributed to women in Greek mythology as a sign of misogyny, given that male characters are also portrayed with significant flaws. All characters in these ancient stories are imperfect, including the gods. But these myths also reflected Greek society at the time. Most often, women in these stories are praised for their beauty, loyalty, caregiving, and childbearing abilities. If they are depicted as positive figures, it's almost always in the context of being a source of inspiration for male heroes. They very rarely drive the story, and when they do, they often appear as ambiguous villains, like Pandora in Hesiod's version, or Medea, a character in the saga of Jason and the Argonauts. Medea was a queen and a sorceress who initially helps Jason but ends disastrously as a murderer, unable to cope when Jason abandons her. In these stories where women are one of the main characters, their lack of control over their impulses and their ambivalence are often highlighted. They are depicted as the bearers of disaster, often unwittingly. Consider also Helen of Troy. Though there are a few exceptions and more ambiguous situations, these character archetypes about women are recurrent. They reflect the position of women in Greek society and also serve to justify it. Women were rarely given any political role. They had fewer rights, and except for a few elite members, they were not given much education. Perhaps one final observation about the myth of Pandora is how it bears similarities to the story of Eve. Eve, the first woman in the world, is central to the narrative of transition from an original state of abundance and ease to a life of suffering. This transition is brought about as a punishment for transgressing a divine command. Pandora opened her jar, and Eve accepted the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, both having ignored explicit warnings not to do so. Did the myth of Pandora inspire the biblical story? Maybe, it's possible. But rather than suggesting Pandora inspired Eve, it could be that this was a common narrative circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean region. Both stories, both figures, might just be illustrations of the same tradition. We know that Greek culture heavily influenced the Levant in the final centuries BC. The classical myth of Pandora was well known to the early Christians, who recognized in her something of an Eve figure. Some historians have argued that Hesiod's interpretation of the myth, which primarily casts Pandora in a negative light, could have influenced the interpretation of Scripture in a way that made the first woman responsible for the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Not that Eve or Pandora were inherently bad or had malicious intentions, but they lacked willpower, exhibited frivolity, making them dangerous for themselves and others, and they led men into sin. The belief that women, by their very nature, are more susceptible to sin and are dangerous for that reason has been significantly diminished in modern mainstream Christian and Jewish doctrines. However, only a few centuries ago, it was common for Christians' theology and moral treatises to argue that the inherent nature of women somehow made them more prone to letting evil in, with all the severe implications it carried. Their morality had to be scrutinized with extra caution. Their behavior had to be controlled, and their unstable emotions had to be restrained due to their perceived inherent weakness and the danger it represented. These types of typical misogynistic stereotypes, of course, did not originate with the myth of Pandora. The myth simply reflects the view that existed in ancient society. However, the narrative of Pandora's myth was certainly used as an argument to perpetuate these stereotypes and to vindicate them. Our next myths will explore the Danaïdes and Sisyphus. I mention them together as they've come to symbolize the same concept, while Pandora's box speaks to the calamities triggered by curiosity and carelessness. The stories of the Danaïdes and Sisyphus address the absurdity of laborious yet futile tasks. But first, the myth of the Danaïdes unfolds like this. Once upon a time, there were two twin brothers who were also kings. Danaus, who ruled over Libya and North Africa, and Aegyptus, who had conquered Egypt. Danaus had 50 daughters, the Danaïdes, and Aegyptus had 50 sons. The identical numbers of sons and daughters they each had, compounded by their fraternity, escalated the risk of a succession war ensuing upon the death of one king. To avert this, it was decided that the 50 daughters of Danaus and the 50 sons of Aegyptus would intermarry, forging strong ties between the two branches of the dynasty. However, as the wedding dates approached, Danaus consulted an oracle. The oracle revealed that the 50 sons of Aegyptus intended not to marry his daughters and live happily ever after, but rather to murder them all post-wedding to secure their rights to the inheritance. In response, Danaus decided to escape with his daughters. They all sailed from Libya to Greece. ultimately reaching Argos, a city where Danaus became king with the help of goddess Athena, who wished for Danaus to prosper and his reign to be mighty. Yet Aegyptus, the other brother, and his 50 sons would not accept this. Aegyptus ordered his sons to pursue Danaus and his daughters to Argos and to compel them to honor their promise of marriage. The 50 sons arrived in Greece and threatened to lay siege to Argos with their army. The city was inadequately defended, forcing Danaus to accept the inevitable situation. He conceded to the 50 weddings, but he could not dismiss the oracle's prediction. He remained convinced that his daughters would be killed the day after their weddings. So he instructed them to conceal long needles in their hair, and once their husbands had fallen asleep on their wedding night, to use these needles to pierce their hearts. And so it was done. The 50 marriages took place, were consummated, and when the son of Aegyptus fell asleep, the daughters of Danaus used their concealed needles and murdered them all, except for one. Hypermnestra spared her cousin and husband, Lynceus, because during their wedding night he had respected her wish to remain a virgin. She was touched by his respect and could not bring herself to kill him. Hypermnestra and Lynceus fled Argos, knowing that the Nows wouldn't let them live. As soon as Lynceus could assemble a small army, he returned to take revenge. He captured Argos and killed Aeneas, along with his 49 murderous daughters. Lynceus and Hypermnestra then began a new dynasty of rulers in Argos. The myth supplied with an origin story for the kings of Argos, but it wasn't over for the 49 daughters. Having died, their souls descended to the underworld, the kingdom of god Hades, where they were judged for their actions for the murders of their cousins. They were sentenced to Tartarus, hell, where they were tasked with washing away their sins by filling a large bathtub with jugs of water. Only when the bathtub was full would they be allowed to escape from Tartarus. However, gods often enjoyed playing tricks on mortals and giving them false hopes, and Hades was no exception. The bathtub in this task had a leak, so every time the ladies would pour their jugs into it, all the water would escape due to the constant leak. The Danaïdes would forever attempt to fill the tub, condemning them to remain in hell for eternity. The story of the Danaïdes is more of a tragedy than a cautionary tale. Their complicity in the murders was dubious given that they had obeyed their father, a duty expected of daughters, and acted in self-defense. They were, in a sense, also victims in this story. But as we've seen with Pandora's tale and with many other myths, Greek gods were not always about justice, benevolence, and compassion. A similar punishment, one sounding more deserved this time, is the one inflicted on Sisyphus. So let's examine this other myth. Sisyphus was the founder and the first king of another significant city, Corinth. He was renowned for his cunning and effective rules, but was also greedy and deceitful. He frequently plotted and nursed grudges, even against his own brother, Salmoneus, also a king, whom he repeatedly attempted to kill or dethrone. Sisyphus was thus entangled in multiple tales of retaliation. One such example involved a feud with his neighbor, Autolycus. Autolycus, a son of the god Hermes, had inherited from his father the ability to steal cattle undetectably. He could transform the animals he stole to make them unrecognizable, preventing their rightful owners from claiming them. Sisyphus owned a large herd of oxen, and with Autolycus residing near Corinth, the thief began to steal some of the oxen under the cover of night. He transformed them to alter their appearance and added them to his own herd. Day after day, or night after night, Sisyphus saw his herd gradually thinning, while Autolycus's herd flourished. He harbored a strong suspicion of foul play, but couldn't accuse Autolycus of theft, as the animals no longer looked the same. To confirm his suspicions, Sisyphus devised a clever scheme. Secretly, he engraved his monogram on the hooves of his oxen. As usual, Autolycus came at night, stole a few of them, changed their appearance, and added them to his own herd. Upon dawn, Sisyphus simply had to follow the distinctive prints of his animals, which led him directly to Autolycus. There he accused him of theft using the monograms on the hooves as evidence. Autolycus was severely punished, but that was insufficient for Sisyphus. While the citizens were brutally handling the thief, he took advantage of the chaos to enter Autolycus' house and assault his daughter. On another occasion, Sisyphus interfered with the affairs of Zeus, a move that would set the stage for his downfall. Zeus had abducted the young and beautiful nymph named Aegina, who was the daughter of Asopus, the river god. As Zeus often did, he had set his eyes on this youthful beauty, but he knew that his wife, Hera, and her father, Asopus, would not accept this relationship, so he decided to capture Aegina and hide her, which would afford him the freedom to do as he pleased. Zeus transformed himself into an eagle to seize the nymph and transport her to a cave atop a mountain, a hideout she could not escape from. However, Sisyphus had witnessed the kidnapping. He knew where Aegina was concealed, and, armed with this valuable information, he approached Asopus. Of course, he would not divulge this information without a price, as it wasn't his nature to do so. He bartered the information for a favor. Asopus would grant him a magical spring located on the Acropolis of Corinth, a spring that could never run dry, in exchange for the whereabouts of his captive daughter. Asopus agreed. Sisyphus obtained his spring, and the river god was able to rescue his daughter, Aegina. Zeus felt offended and ridiculed, something he would not tolerate. As a result, he decided to punish Sisyphus severely. No intricate scheme was needed this time. Zeus simply summoned the god of death, Thanatos, and ordered him to secure Sisyphus, and ensured he'd be judged harshly upon his arrival in Hades, the world of the dead. Thanatos set out to confront Sisyphus. Unwilling to bow or accept his fate, the king of Corinth devised a trick. He offered to showcase some of his inventions to Thanatos as a personification of death. Thanatos seldom had entertainment opportunities. His existence revolved around visiting the living to conclude their earthly lives, so he agreed to explore the inventions. Sisyphus proceeded to show him a newly made pair of handcuffs. As the god of death inspected them with curiosity, Sisyphus locked them around his wrists, capturing the deity and later incarcerating him. Sisyphus had outsmart death itself, and as a result, people stopped dying. Zeus was irate and could not tolerate the suspension of death, so he summoned the god of war, Ares, and ordered him to free Thanatos and also escort Sisyphus to the world of the dead, a realm from which nearly no one could ever return. And so it was done. Ares traveled to Corinth, freed Thanatos, who could resume his duties, seized Sisyphus, and escorted him across the river Styx, the boundary marking the entrance to the kingdom of Hades. Yet again, Sisyphus had foreseen this. He understood well that capturing Thanatos would not conclude his conflicts with Zeus. So before another deity was summoned to detain him, he instructed his wife to forego arranging a funeral for his deceased body. She was to leave his body on the bed and prevent anyone from burying her husband, an order she obeyed. Meanwhile, Sisyphus was presented to Hades to be judged. The king argued that he couldn't enter the realm of the dead until his remains were buried properly. He proposed a temporary return to the world of the living to take care of the funeral preparations, promising he would return afterward to accept whatever judgment Hades deemed fitting. Much like Thanatos before him, Hades was unaccustomed to such duplicitous behavior from mortals. He was unaware that Sisyphus hadn't been given a proper funeral due to his own explicit directions. So the lord of the underworld agreed to release Sisyphus temporarily in exchange for his promise to quickly settle his funeral arrangements. Once he returned to the world of the living, his lifeless body miraculously came back to life. Yet, interestingly, he held no intention of returning to the underworld. Therefore, he didn't proceed with his own funeral and instead resumed his life. He had cheated death for the second time, making a mockery of the gods. This time, the gods concurred that this defiance could not continue any further. Thanatos was summoned once again to deliver Sisyphus to Hades, where he was sentenced to spend eternity in Tartarus. But Zeus and Hades contrived a special punishment for the man who believed he could outsmart them. Sisyphus would have to perpetually roll a boulder up a steep hill in Tartarus. The boulder was enchanted to evade Sisyphus before he reached the hill's peak, subjecting the deposed king to an eternity of fruitless efforts and constant frustration. This punish imprisoned him in a state of perpetual unfulfillment. As we tell these stories and enjoy a moment's respite, somewhere in the underworld, Sisyphus eternally pushes his boulder in the hope that he'll surmount the hill this time. Yet, predictably, the boulder rolls down the incline and he must descend to resume his eternal task. Sisyphus was ultimately punished for his hubris, that is, his excessive pride and overconfidence in his abilities. He forgot this mortal condition and elicited devastating consequences on himself. Primarily on himself, but many Greek myths caution against hubris, especially in sovereigns and powerful individuals. This blend of overconfidence and pride could invite disasters upon an entire population. Consider, for instance, the risk of provoking divine wrath or instigating war without fully contemplating the ramifications. Another well-known myth that serves as a cautionary tale of hubris is the myth of Icarus, To conclude tonight's story, let's revisit it. Icarus was the son of a talented architect, Daedalus, who was employed by the king of Crete. King Minos, the king commissioned Daedalus to design and construct the labyrinth, a vast maze where he placed the Minotaur, a creature half bull, half man. The hero who defied King Minos entered the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, and found his way back with the aid of a ball of string given by Ariadne, Minos's daughter. He traced the thread back to the entrance and escaped from Crete with Ariadne to return safe and sound. The tale of Icarus unfolds after these events. King Minos was infuriated by the death of the Minotaur, the betrayal, and the loss of his daughter, not to mention her escape with Theseus. The labyrinth was now vacant, and Theseus had evaded its traps. The situation called for punishment, and the unfortunate recipients were Daedalus and his son Icarus. The architect was imprisoned within his own labyrinth. However, despite being the labyrinth's creator, it was too vast and intricate for Daedalus to recall the entire layout and discern the way out. It seemed that the father and son were doomed to die of starvation. Yet the architect was intelligent and resourceful. Within the labyrinth, he discovered various materials and crafted wings from them. These wings were constructed from feathers and held together with beeswax. Affixed to their arms, Daedalus and Icarus could mimic the flapping of birds' wings. The strategy worked, and soon Daedalus and Icarus rose above the labyrinth, intending to fly away from Crete and return to Greece. However, beforehand, Daedalus had warned his son about the fragility of the wings. He cautioned him not to ascend too high or too close to the sun, as heat would melt the wax, nor should he fly too close to the sea, as the feathers could get wet and cease to be effective. Icarus vowed to adhere to his father's instructions. The pair then began their escape, leaving the island behind and flying over the sea. The fear and anxiety of confinement dissipated as their escape proved successful, filling Icarus with increasing joy and confidence. So confident, in fact, he disregarded his father's counsel and soared skyward, even higher. He was curious to see the world from such great heights and intent on discovering how high he could ascend. As he continued, he drew closer and closer to the sun, causing the heat to gradually melt the beeswax that held the feathers together. One by one, they drifted down like snowfall, but all Icarus did was gaze skyward, oblivious to his predicament. He kept flapping his arms until he realized that he was no longer ascending. He glanced at his wings and saw that he was merely flapping his bare arms. His wings were no more. As a result, Icarus plummeted from the sky like a stone and fell into the sea, where he drowned. The lesson from this tale is rather straightforward. Icarus had everything he needed to ensure a successful escape. He had even been warned about the dangers of ascending too high. However, his overconfidence and lack of pragmatism made him overlook these cautionary points, leading to his literal and metaphorical downfall. This myth has endured the passage of centuries, giving way to the popular phrase, flying too close to the sun. The story has also caught the attention of modern psychologists and psychiatrists who recognize the psychological pattern it represents. This pattern, known as a form of overcompensation, describes individuals who entertain grandiose aspirations despite having insufficient means because they lack realism or are overcompensating, or feelings of inferiority by erring on the side of extremes. This is what inspired the proposition of the term Icarus complex. In its original form, this myth cautions against not only flying too high, but also too low, both of which would be harmful. This tale can be interpreted as an invitation to find and maintain an appropriate balance. We have reached the end of our stories for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you can pick another story from my library. I will be back soon with a new one. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.